Hi everyone. Today we are very pleased to share another podcast with Dr. Erik Goodwyn as part of our ongoing collaboration with him and his work. This time around, Dr. Goodwyn and I discuss the specific molecular kinetics of the genome and gene expression as the biological informational representation of the psyche, including so-called archetypes and complexes. We bring in evidence from evolution, Jaak Panksepp's affective neuroscience, and cutting-edge omics biology to support the case that the informational carrying capacity of the genome is easily large enough to encode so-called symbolic information, and that, moment to moment, a change in a biological omics state, that is, in protein or RNA as gene expression products, will correlate with a change in psychodynamics as an inbuilt sense of teleology rooted in homeostasis. In the second half of our conversation, we turn our attention towards the nature of conscious qualia, where, through real-time dialectical syncretism, we try and derive a shared working model and nomenclature of consciousness, considering the nuances that brings with a psychodynamic perspective. Dr. Goodwyn draws on his cosmopsychism model, and I briefly speak on Penrose and Hameroff's Orch-OR theory of quantum consciousness, as was briefly elucidated in our recently released video thesis, Logos Vitae, in the context of psychodynamics. Both share a Platonic substrate, which I'm sure that we will continue to speak on in future video collaborations. If you haven't already, we highly recommend you check out the recent podcast we released, hosted between Steve and Pauline Richards and Dr. Goodwyn, as well as Dr. Goodwyn's paper from 2020, published in the Journal for Analytical Psychology, entitled Archetypes and the Impoverished Genome Argument: Updates from Evolutionary Genetics, as both of them form a useful prerequisite viewing for the show today. Thanks everyone, and we really hope that you enjoy. Maybe a good, starting point might be the impoverished genome paper, because I think there's some really important stuff in there. So it's really nice with molecular biology. You've mentioned the lac operon. We can go down that direction.
Sure.
Loads of stuff to do with systems biology in general we can talk about too, that dovetails nicely with that.
The one I published in last year, Journal of Analytical Psychology.
Yeah. Because when I read that, I think I read that middle of last year for the first time. When you mentioned that carrying capacity of the genome is increased by the fact that genes exist in a network, I thought that was absolutely key to getting a dialogue going. Because the fallacy that, I know you've written in there, say there's 30,000 genes approximately, the fallacy that one gene equals one protein, or if we're talking about consciousness, one gene equals one qualia, we know not to be true. There's a whole biology in there. So the carrying capacity of the genome is way bigger, probably multiple magnitudes log scale bigger than those 30,000 genes. So that could be a go down.
Well, and I mean, that 30,000 genes, I only use that number because Jean Knox used it in her paper. And then later on, I talk about how the gene count has actually gone down from that to, I think, around 22 or 23,000. But it doesn't matter, because not only is there all these other things that aren't protein coding things that are still genes because they regulate other genes, but at the end of the day, it's a number, right? How many does it take? If we have no idea how many it takes, then we don't know whether or not it can encode for symbolic information of some kind. And I mean, you know better than most that vast majority of genes are pleiotropic in their expression, meaning that one gene has many different outcomes and can affect many different things. So, phenylketonuria is one good example. It's one gene that's that's different, and it affects a whole host of different body systems, because that one gene is involved in so many different things. Well, it's just because, like you said, they interact with each other. So what we're dealing with is a combinatorial system. So then to say that 22 or 30 or whatever it is not enough, it's just like saying 26 letters is not enough letters in the alphabet to encode the entire works of Shakespeare. Well, guess what? Yeah, it is. Because you can combine them in so many different zillions of different ways. So it's massive. The information capacity is massive.
Yeah. Yeah, it was when it's about 15 years ago, the eukaryotic genome was, in fact, should we just carry on this conversation as is and then record it?
Just keep going. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, cool. So yeah, about 15 years ago, the eukaryotic genome, so obviously that includes humans as well as a whole host of other organisms and cells on the planet, including yeast, which is used as the model eukaryote. That was found that way more of the genome than we initially thought was actually transcribed into useful material. So back 20 years ago or so, it was only something like 2% of the genome is useful, something that was pushed out, and 98% is junk.
Junk DNA, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. That's now since enormously fallen out of favor because of the discovery of pervasive genome-wide transcription. And it's something like, at the very least, 75% of all genomic regions, discrete from one another in yeast at the very least, encodes useful products. And the vast majority of those aren't protein, they're non-coding.
Right.
Non-coding RNAs. So when we're talking about one useful product out of one genomic open reading frame, again, the fallacy stands up immediately to say, no, we're looking at potentially regulation along any step from genome to protein. So that can take place transcription, splicing, translation, or even in the Golgi or in the endoplasmic reticulum, anything like that. But you can also change, feasibly so, and I think for mathematical modeling, you can definitely do this. You can ask the question, if I change just one non-coding expression of non-coding RNA in the cell, could that feasibly have an effect on something I initially considered to be, say, a psychological qualia or the equivalent of an informational representation? I think you can. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think so too.
Not only is it, say, symbolic information, therefore can mathematically find its origin in the genome, but so can resultant images, as any host of inbuilt or environmentally informed images at all. Because we've got, as you say earlier, 26 different letters. And it's like, in reality, that's going to be billions upon billions upon billions upon billions.
Yeah, of potential combinations.
Yeah.
And not infinite, but humongous.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned splicing too, because I mean, that's just one gene can be spliced in a bunch of different ways. So that's even more, it's a combinatorial explosion of information potential. I was just reading a paper, actually, it was looking at fish, a stickleback something. Anyway, so what they had observed, the thing that jumped out at me about this paper, I'm reading about the Baldwin effect, and they were talking about how they observed a behavior. They had two different subspecies of this fish, one of which they used as a stand-in for the ancestor, because they justified that through various means. The environment wasn't any different than it was thousands of years ago, compared to one of its offshoots that lived in freshwater. And they noted that if the conditions were right, behavioral strategies that the old fish used 12,000 years ago, but hadn't since, could resurface in the right conditions. Yeah. So when I talk about ancestral memory, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Stuff that can resurface. Now, 12,000 years is a long time. We're just talking about fish. They got these little tiny, brains. We've got these monstrous brains, so, and I know it's not a one-to-one comparison, but I mean, come on, there's so much there.
There is.
That could, who knows? So,
yeah, unless we're under selection pressure, like evolutionarily so, to lose something, a certain trait, then we're not going to lose it. And these things can feasibly sit dormant forever in the genome because the cell doesn't care. The amount of energy to maintain, say, I don't know, one gene, or say like a million nucleotides or something like that, there's going to be nothing relative to the whole cell. So what you got to do is say, okay, the promoter region that turns that gene on and off, that relies on a very specific environmental input. And it can sit there, as you say, for 12,000 years and never surface. And all of a sudden, feasibly so. And again, because the genome in and of itself, at least psychosocially, we can consider it to be inert. It's until transcription is turned on, it's inert. So it's just a template. And different regions can be reused for different things, et cetera, et cetera. So when you pointed out, I think you're impoverished on the argument against the impoverished genome that you put forward in that paper. It's going to be a crucial stepping stone to getting that dialectic going between the biology and the psychology, to say, look, the biologists aren't trying to reduce psychology down at all. We're just trying to continue a conversation, make it more exciting.
Well, and connect the things that have been so long disconnected, which would be mind and body. Yeah. Showing that the genome can have an influence on the way we think is part of the dialogue. And only in Jung, really, do we see very much emphasis placed on that at all. And Jungian theory and practice involves aligning a person's ego with their own instincts. But if you can't talk about what the heck those instincts are, except in these very vague, sort of hand-wavy terms, then it's just a mental exercise, right? It's not anything connected to the science. And I think we're to the point where we don't need to do that anymore. Back in Jung's day, maybe he needed to collapse the self onto just this psychological concept. But I think now we're getting to the point where we can describe what exactly that is. And of course, Stephen Pauline connected to the genome, which I think makes perfect sense. And the thing that drives me bonkers about these conversations, though, is that when I bring up biology, I inevitably get, but what about learning? And but what about environmental influence? Mm-hmm. And epigenetic modification, right? That word gets misused so much.
Yes, it does.
It gets abused. And even one of the scholars that was engaging with this stuff was talking about because there was a response to that paper, and then I responded to the response. I don't know if you read that part.
I haven't seen those actually, no.
You haven't? I'll send that to you.
Thanks.
But it was talking about how that in modern biology we tend to think in terms of gene environment coaction, that the things work together to produce output and all that. And that's true. That is true in a general sense. But what we're interested in, though, is if I engage with or encounter a scenario that may have repeated itself throughout the life of many, many, many people, so much that it's found its way into the genome, then my genome is responding to that in an instinctive sort of way. So yes, the gene and the environment are co-acting in a general sense. That's true. But the genome is really kind of running the show here. It's sort of like the example I use is if you're not careful, you can gloss over the differences by saying gene environment coaction in the same way that you could say that the statue of David is like Michelangelo and stone lump coaction. I think I mentioned that the other day with Steve. And one of the players is an asymmetry here, right? And part of the problem is that I think people talk about how the genome can affect the environment. Of course, everybody knows that. And then they'll say, well, yeah, okay, so but the environment affects the genome. True. But it doesn't change the genome. It affects how it is manifest. And that is exactly how the genome is intended to work. It's set up to do that. So there's no big shock there. If the environment actually changes the genome, we call that mutation, and that's bad. And the genome has all kinds of protective mechanisms to keep that from happening, right? So we've got like melanin in the skin to protect from damage from the sun. We've got there's the excision repair process that goes on. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you are. I got to stop assuming that you don't know what I'm talking about. That's great, because then you know what I'm talking about. 30 different genes working together to repair damage done to the genome. The environment doesn't do that. The genome does. So there is kind of this, that's where the central dogma comes from. That's where it flows. Yes, the environment is important and it plays its part, but only in the sense of it triggers stuff that's the genome is wanting to, or needs to do.
Yeah. So this has got me curious then. So maybe it's not in that specific critique or response that was leveled at your paper, but what's the usual impression of how these, say, learning, memory, behavior, whatever, what's the impression or the substrate within biology that's considered to be? If it's not the genome at base, is there something else that's proposed?
Search me. I'm not sure. It's not like that's ever talked about, really. It's more at the behavioral level.
Yeah.
But that's fine too. And I can play that game as well if we need to, because if someone, for example, what we were talking about, how the critique of that the genome doesn't contain enough information to encode symbolic information, right? That's a critique brought forward by Gene Knox that has been repeated multiple times throughout Jungian literature. And despite me screaming about it constantly. And so the question is for me then, there are certain things that happen that cannot be explained if that is true. For example, human facial expressions. A facial expression is literally a symbol of an emotional state. It is a face that represents a state. That's a symbol. And those are almost completely independent of environmental variation. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't use the environment. Obviously, everything uses, a genome uses environment because it has to. A genome laying there by itself doesn't do anything, right? It interacts, it creates, it does its thing. But people born blind still have the same facial expressions to express their emotions. But how does that work if it's learned, if it has to be learned? They can't learn it from someone else. It's not, it doesn't need to be learned or observed. I should put it that way.
Yeah.
Right. So now, of course, that in the biological world, we just call it phenotypic plasticity and don't worry about it. Call it learning if you want. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Right. And then they focus on how does that manifest? How does it change across multiple, thousands of generations? Does phenotypic plasticity get fixed down to non-plastic gene expression in certain circumstances? Yes, no, blah, 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 all that stuff. But in the psychological world, we still kind of stuck in the old nature-nurture dichotomy.
Yeah.
And we don't recognize that learning is all well and good, but it doesn't happen if the biology is not set up for it.
Yes. Yes, like human beings can't fly because the genome does not allow for it. And that's kind of a reductio ad absurdum in a way, but it does kind of match. I mean, so this is what I was interested in, because all molecules decay over time, but just these innate inbuilt decay constants that are radioactively based. Right. So whatever a cell is, whenever people will have shared view of what a cell is, everything within that is on a clock. The RNA will decay, the protein will decay, and the DNA will decay as well. So the DNA's got an inbuilt mechanism to keep repeating itself. Whereas right. the other gene expression products, the protein and RNA, don't. So anything that we learn, if it stays around for the length of the lifespan, it's got one of two things as a biological substrate. It's either encoded within the genome in potentia per se, even if it's something pathological, it's in potentia in there, or somehow it's encoded in a protein or an RNA that has a lifespan of 80 years. Mm-hmm. As far as I'm aware, there's no known proteins or RNA that do that at all. The average lifespan of protein is somewhere around 43 hours in neurons, there or thereabouts, at least at the very least in non-dividing mammalian cells. And RNA, say messenger RNA, it's even shorter. And then with long non-coding RNA, it's like 3 hours or 2 to 3 hours. It's not a lifespan. So it's not as if the genome, say, encodes everything per se, but it's exactly as you're suggesting. It's like there's an environmental influence, perhaps under certain conditions, that can encode what we would call to be learning, but our bandwidth to have that in the first place is allowed for by the genome. Even something like getting an injury from the outside world, like someone coming along with a knife and cutting someone's leg. It's like that. That's obviously not encoded in the genome, but the potential for it is, because of the geometry of the cells, the coagulation factors, the platelets, everything else. So we're locked into being human. I think that's perhaps the most offensive thing, at the very least, I'm suggesting here, and I'm sure you agree with that. It's like we're locked into being human, and it's the potential is encoded via the genome. That's something I learned from Steve and Pauline. Their emphasis on human potential was, say, the therapeutic outcome. So that's true on multiple levels, right down to the biology.
Well, yeah, that's where it all begins, the biology of it, because just like the behavioral response that has been dormant for 12,000 years and then suddenly emerges in the right conditions, the genome is not just a template, it's a record. It contains the history of the organism all the way up to today, right? You've got the latest version of it, and it's continually updating. A long time ago, when I first, right after I published Neurobiology of the Gods, I spoke with this lady who was, this was probably my first encounter with the true Jungians, right? Because she said, do you think that some of what you're talking about can be equated with the Akashic record?
Oh, okay.
And yeah, and I'm like, what in the world is that? I had no idea what she was talking about. I looked it up. I'm like, whoa, okay, this is wild. So that was my first exposure. But in a sense, it does kind of contain the history of the organism, and your particular history is your version of it. When it broke off from your ancestors and so forth, all the way back 3.5 billion years ago. Because as you know, we've got pieces of our DNA that are identical with reptiles. The sonic hedgehog gene is present in fish, but in fish it's used to form fins, and in humans it's used to form legs and arms. But it's the same gene, which shows that we've got the common ancestor. And so, yeah, the other thing is, here's another thing about learning, right? So this is what I've been talking about more in some of my more recent papers. Learning to walk involves learning. That's why it's called learning to walk, right? But it's not anything you observe, right? People born blind can teach themselves how to walk, and they do. It maybe take a little bit longer, but they still do it. So self-teaching is a thing that organisms do as well. They teach themselves to do stuff. So then, is that genetic or is that learned? It's in that weird category there, and I think it's a complete waste of time to worry so much about that, but rather ask yourself, what is the intent behind this? Is there intent the genome has that you walk? And I think it's trivial to show that is of course the case, because if you look at the fossils of our quadrupedal ancestors, our skeletons are totally different. And in many ways, and not totally different, right? There's some key differences, right? So the foramen magnum is on the bottom instead of the back of the head, because we're not walking around like this all the time. We're straight up. We got to be perpendicular. And then there's differences in the pelvis and in the joints and the vascular system and the reflexes and all of that kind of stuff. So either there's an intent there that the genome has towards that behavior that involves learning. It says, go learn this, right? Or all of those skeletal changes are just an amazing coincidence.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Some of this trying to boil down and question the real first principles, I think, is just a way of getting in the way of the argument, really, isn't it? It's like, are we intended to speak? And it's like, maybe some people shouldn't, but that's more of a moral case than anything else.
Yeah.
And it's not as if necessarily, or really at all from a molecular biology frame, that the genome has like an overarching intelligence. And this is something I wanted to ask you about, actually. Obviously the genome itself is a system that's made out of elementary particles and composite particles, so atoms, basically. And when we're talking about, say, the purpose of the genome, that the teleology, at the very least, for the purposes of, say, dialectical syncretism, is going to be resultant out of the substrate rather than saying a priori, if you know what I mean. It's like the genome has a purpose. It's like, no, the genome is just going to do what it's going to do. unfolding of the lifespan from the moment that it's formed.
Yeah.
Certain transcription factors are going to be active in the cytoplasm of the cell. That's going to turn certain genes on. They're going to decay. That's the clock-based stuff. And then it's going to unfold. And then it's open, therefore, or semi-open to environmental influence, to say change certain things, you know, turning them on and turning them off. Yeah. So the precondition then isn't necessarily there's a set teleology. It's just molecules are going to do what molecules are going to do. So I was thinking about this recently. And this dovetails really nicely with, say, some of the stuff I've learned from Stephen Pauline on the unfolding of the lifespan. It's as if, to me, that's a priori to Darwin, to me personally. It's like survival as, say, a purpose of an organism. I think it's just a description of a state. You're either alive or you're not alive. You know, reproduction is part of the lifespan. But what we are is a simple unfolding as an overall semi-permeable system of the laws of nature itself at that genomic level, you know, and therefore beneath that into chemistry. So I think we can sidestep an argument of like nature nurture to some degree and lay a different ground state and say, you know, are we meant to learn to walk? Are we not meant to learn to walk? It's just what the resultant teleology appears to be from ego consciousness of the unfolding of the laws of nature. And that sort of puts Jung's individuation, or at the very least the lifespan unfolding process, as the precondition for everything else that then results out of that.
That sounds reasonable. Now, I mean, in medicine, we use, and in evolutionary science, we use teleology all the time. And it just sneaks in because we use the terms like function. Like this has the function of X, Y, and Z. What does that really mean? And so I think it's okay and it's fair to use those terms without risking any sort of philosophical faux pas, because it's bloody well there, right? And we know that, how can we talk about, and this is part of the mind-body problem in the philosophy of mind, is how can we talk about teleology as not existing if we have it, right? So it comes from somewhere. So I don't think it's necessary to discount final causality if you want to get into the Aristotelian terms, right? And the example that I just gave about walking is essentially the same one that Aristotle used to defend the concept, only he used teeth in that case. But I think it's interesting that he used a biological organism to demonstrate final causality, because it's not going to necessarily be present in a rock. Rock doesn't necessarily have an intent, but an organism does, and that maybe is not there in the parts, but it is in the whole. And that, I think, is probably where the debate might end up leading, is, are we talking about an intent, like you said, like you were saying, of each individual molecule is not so much got an intent per se, unless you want to. I've seen this done like John Whewell talks about this in his work, of even an electron has an intent of its own, in a sense. It's just not very complex. It's very simple. But then as we build up bigger and bigger systems, because of complexity and all that sort of thing, a whole can acquire properties that the individual parts don't have when isolated. Okay, one of those could very well be final causality. And I published a paper last year on the mind-body problem that looks at this very issue in terms of where does consciousness come from? Because that's the same question, really, using a different piece, but it's asking the same kind of thing. Where does this stuff come from? And in some philosophical systems, the quest is to try to find where it comes from in the parts. They're pluralistic by nature. They're not holistic. And that's physicalism, right? Where the mind is somehow created by the brain. But of course, the problem is that nobody can explain how that happens. Like, the brain just seems to sort of magically appear out of thin air. And a lot of philosophers find that to be a regrettable state, shall we say. And so come up with other solutions like panpsychism, and my solution was cosmopsychism, which is another type of philosophy that's gaining a little more steam these days. it's really an ancient idea that the cosmos itself is conscious, and all of other consciousnesses are derivative from it, rather than trying to do it the other way around and say that atoms somehow create consciousness when they're arranged just so, and consciousness just sort of appears ex nihilo. Some physical, that's the big problem that physicalists run into, is that one. And they try all these different ways to get around it. But ultimately, it's the kind of thing that you're asking, I think, is where does the teleology come from, right? And so I think that that the genome, even though it's just a really, really big set of molecules, it's arranged in such a way, and it's been built over so many thousands and millions of generations that it qualifies. It's got an agenda.
Yeah.
An agenda is build a human or whatever, or a stickleback fish or whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah.
And what you're talking about, or did I just?
No, yeah. That's a really good way of stating it. One of the perhaps one of the most useful ways to try and have a shared nomenclature within psychology and biology is the shared use of homeostasis.
Yeah.
And that's where your exegesis on the lac operon in that impoverished genome paper works really nicely, because you've got one genomic region, or basically like a cluster of genes, and it's got a set point or multiple set points of homeostasis. Yeah. And it will tend towards one or the other depending on what's available in the environment. Therefore, there is teleology there, literally just in the mechanics of the molecules. Yeah. So if we take one instinct, whatever we define it, say in Panksepian terms, exclusion, say the general. Well, I'll slow down for a moment. It's as if the seeking system, underpins all the other emotional systems, because the solution to restore homeostasis is non-local in space-time, right? It's like solutions out there, I've got to seek it.
Gotta go get it.
Yeah. So as for all the other ones, they all represent at a slightly more abstracted, or in say the terms of George Engel, different levels on that biopsychosocial stack, levels of analysis, description, and explanation. They represent sort of different set points of homeostasis. The same thing is true if whatever an archetype may or may not turn out to be. The same thing will be true of that. The same thing will be true of complexes. Same thing is true of all of it. And it's as if in a systems biology or a systems psychobiology sense, what we are in terms of teleology is a competing set points of homeostasis. And the therapeutic interaction seems to be, okay, part of you, quote unquote, not to suggest multiple personalities, of course, is going in this way, but the deeper part of you, that genomic intent, actually wants to go this way. So there's almost like two different, we can describe it poetically if you want to, right? Two different timelines, or two different potential futures that sort of open up. So teleology, as say spoken about in psychology, philosophy, etc., is innate in the biology as well. It's just the unfolding kinetics, and we can resolve it all the way down, including down to the quantum realm as well, especially if we include such things as the Orch-OR theory. We're speaking with Professor Stuart Hameroff soon. We're really excited about it. And in fact, when you mentioned cosmopsychism, that reminded me in a way of Penrose's idea that wherever there's an orchestrated reduction collapse of the waveform, you get proto-consciousness. So that, I think there's about 3 different potential things I've implicitly asked you in there. We can sort of take this in any direction.
Yeah, we could. Now, I have read the Orch-OR paper and the responses to it, but it was years ago, so I'm a little rusty on it. And I do remember it was pretty mathematically intense too. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there, more recently in this philosophical paper that I was working on, they talk about the difference between holism and pluralism, and how under a mereological monistic system, so mereology being the study of parts and wholes, the most prior and most fundamental object is the universe itself, and everything else is derived from it, rather than the other way around, which is to say that the most fundamental pieces are the the physical symbols, so quarks or whatever, and that everything is derivative of those working together. That's a pluralistic system. So one of the arguments for monism is that the universe is an entangled quantum system, one big ginormous quantum entangled system. And that if that is so, then if consciousness comes from somewhere, because we know it exists, right? Then through a long and circuitous path, you can get to one of the end results, possibly being that the universe is conscious as a part of that. And it's because of the quantum entanglement across the board. So that sounds like it may make sense with what you were saying about the collapse of the waveform being a type of proto-consciousness, because it derives, but in my system, it's because it derives from the greater cosmic consciousness.
Yeah. So it's I'm trying to kind of perform a bit of dialectical syncretism in real time, because I've been studying the Orcho-R stuff more or less non-stop for the last few weeks. So it's kind of filled my head quite a lot.
Okay.
But basically what Penrose describes, so Roger Penrose, Nobel laureate, he describes that everywhere in the universe, or the potential everywhere in the universe, you can have what's called an orchestrated reduction, collapse of a wave function. So as you're saying, things can exist in a superposition, say in an electron. And after a certain amount of time, because of the gravitational component involved, existing in two states at once becomes unstable. So it is alternative to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics to say you don't necessarily need an observer looking at an electron or not. It will just at a certain threshold of time go boom, one way or the other. And what himself and Stuart Hameroff have proposed is that orchestrated reduction collapse is synonymous with a moment of proto-consciousness.
Yeah.
How consciousness is defined, well, it's not really. It's more kind of a phenomenological experience. What they are saying is that conscious qualia, in kind of a Platonic sense in a way, are an inbuilt part of the universe. So that's kind of what came up when you were mentioning your cosmopsychism stuff.
Yeah, that does, I think that aligns with it, at least at the surface level. I'd have to dive deeper to see if it connected in other levels, but it sure sounds like it.
Yeah.
It sure sounds like it, because that's essentially what I'm saying. And it's not even really my idea. It's I built on the work of philosopher Philip Goff, for example, and David Chalmers to a degree, philosophers in the philosophy of mind. But of course, like you mentioned, the qualia issue, in that they seem to be relatively impervious to description or reduction.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that physicalism has a real challenge explaining. If something is irreducible, like redness, right, or the flavor of something or other, then how can it be built up by parts? It's irreducible, which means that's incoherent to say that it's built up from other things, right? Same thing with like pain fibers and the feeling of pain. What is in the blipping pain fibers that feels like ouch?
Yes.
That's the problem. And the philosophers use this thing they call the inverted qualia problem, like to try to tease this out and say, does your theory of consciousness, how does it deal with this problem of, let's imagine that you've got a brain that has pain fibers but doesn't feel the ouch, but it responds as if it did. That's the philosophical zombie problem. If you can't explain that, then you're suggesting that there is something more than neurons to consciousness, which is a holistic point of view. And if you're a reductionist, whether consciously or not, you're going to object to that. But I'm not, so I don't have to object to that. I can say the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. Well, not always, but usually. I'll send you that paper too.
Yeah, please do. That'll be an interesting read. I mean, it's some of the research out of Jaak Panksepp's labs and affective neuroscience is so fascinating to me, because you can, obviously you can't do it on humans necessarily. I think sometimes you can, but it becomes a bit unethical. You can say, I'll electrically stimulate this region of the brain and you'll feel utter euphoria. Or if I electrically stimulate this part of the brain, you feel, and that's the key point with Panksepp. And he kept saying in affective neuroscience, the text from the 90s, he kept hammering on about this, where he's like, this stuff is not just a cold behaviorism with no conscious qualia. The feeling is the point. The affect is the point. And a certain region of the brain allows you to feel one emotion and another allows you to feel another. but they're both neurons. They're both firing with action potentials. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
where is that information? Is it in the frequency of action potential? Then I think in that instance, you have an impoverished action potential argument to try and dovetail with your earlier paper. There's only so much information you can encode in an action potential frequency, right? So where is it? Where is it? And it's the same thing as well as saying, why is it that a quark or an electron, the most fundamental particles in the universe, why do they have inbuilt qualities?
Yeah.
Why do we have spin and charge, and apparently color is another thing in quarks as well? Why do they exist? I think it's probably the same problem. I think they're going to dovetail at some point, at least in methodology, as if there's some platonic element behind.
Well, yeah, I mean, any philosophical system, any metaphysics eventually runs into what we call brute facts, which is a fact of the universe that cannot itself be explained by something else. Because if you don't, then you end up with infinite regress. Right? Because you can always just say, okay, well, where does that come from? Or what is that made of? And all that sort of thing. So you're always going to run into them. The question is, how many of them do you want? Right? So like a pluralistic system says you've got all of these neurons working together, right? And then when they're just so, anger emerges as a qualia. Okay, so then is that anger emerge in a brute manner, meaning that we can't explain it? It's just a fundamental feature of the universe and deal with it?
Yeah.
or not, right? You know, so I think there are some philosophers that have basically decided that must be how it works. Like Jonathan Schaeffer is a philosopher who ascribes to that idea, that complex systems of parts will just display holistic properties, and it just emerges like water, like hydrogen and oxygen, that neither one of them looks like water, but when you stick them together, they acquire waterness.
Yes.
Right, and they behave in a certain way that can't be really easily predicted from the molecules necessarily. And so he says that's just brute emergence. That's how it works. I'm not terribly happy with that explanation, which is why I flip it around and say it's a holistic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, no disrespect to that guy, but it does remind me of Richard Feynman's principle. Knowing the name of something doesn't mean you know anything about the thing in and of itself. So it's like labeling something, going, that explains it, and it's like it doesn't. It's almost like de facto ossification of the model and the thinking, sort of quietening it down. I mean, Panksepp proposed, of course you know this, but Panksepp proposed that these different emotional systems could somehow link up to produce, say, higher animal emotions as well, like shame and jealousy and things like that. But in that case, theoretically, it would have to be in potentia mathematically modelable. Yeah. Same thing with when you're mentioning water or hydrogen and oxygen. We might not understand how, when they combine, they give rise to all these different properties, but theoretically they can be. And if you can mathematically model the system, you can see how it resolves across time. That allows you to go back to where these things come from. But there's something at core that we're missing right at the base. And I think the psychology, the biology, and the physics all bottom out in the same place. That's just following Engel down the stack, right?
Yeah.
Come down to these composite fundamental particles and their interactions. Even if, say, consciousness is not a particle, like that whole, like a reduction idea, is at the very least an interaction between them or feeds into them. It's a system. It has to be.
It's a form. I think consciousness comes from form. So it's my argument is an argument for formal causation, because like you were asking earlier, why is it that when I stimulate this neural network, I feel rage, and this neural network, I feel hunger or whatever, or seeking? There's nothing inherently in the neurons themselves that create this any more than there is than if you were to look at the melody, is what I use in the argument I use in paper. If you look at the Ode to Joy, the melody of Ode to Joy, right? Everybody knows that melody. But there's nothing about Ode to Joy in middle C.
Yeah.
See? It's how they're arranged together in a particular form that gives you the property of that melody. Same thing for consciousness or all of these other qualia, is the particular form in which they take. And by form, I mean through time as well. So they can change. And of course, when you look at neural networks that are associated with consciousness, there's a pervasive whole system quality that they have, the various, frequencies and all that. So that and vibrating in such a particular way. The qualia problem is, why is vibrating that way feel this way? That's the qualia problem. Yeah. We don't even need to get that deep into it, really. We can just say that the consciousness is associated with the form of the parts. When you take the parts out of the system and isolate them, then they don't have a form anymore. There's just a part.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why the search for proto-consciousness in an electron, I think, is doomed to failure. Because we're looking at the parts isolated, and we need to look at the whole thing. So, like the way Aristotle put this was, you could have a statue of Zeus in bronze or marble, but there's really no Zeusness in bronze or marble. It's the shape of the thing that makes it Zeus, right? Same idea here, except not so much shape, but behavior and form across time.
Yes. I like that idea a lot. And I just to add sort of one thing to the end of that, do you reckon then that we'll be able to find informational representation at the level of, say, the proteome, the transcriptome, and genome for a given, not necessarily one-to-one correlation, but for any given so-called qualia to be consistent down the stack?
That's a tough one, because if you follow my argument down to its logical conclusion, then you're going to say that, okay, Dr. Goodwyn, what do you mean by form? I mean form in the Platonic sense, meaning that when the form is achieved or obtained, the qualia manifests, but it won't necessarily be there unless the form obtains. So if there's something in the genome or proteome or whatever it is that has that as a potential, then it is encoded in there.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess the short answer would be yes.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm not saying that you can look into the genome and see a blueprint in there anywhere.
Yeah. No.
Because it's a program for, how do I get to this form? Right. That's the intentionality. If that quality is needed for the organism, then that's what will be encoded. How do I get to that? How do I get to that? I think that if you adopt a panpsychistic system to explain consciousness and say that it's a pervasive quality of the universe, then biological evolution will select for certain species to be able to obtain consciousness. It's like, here's how you find it because it's useful. But I think that obtaining consciousness in its full, like, cosmic form is probably not going to be all that conducive to an organism surviving. So there's going to be also pieces in there that constrain it, which get loosened up with things like psilocybin or DMT. So there's going to be biological stopgaps and breaks on the system that also orients us towards finding consciousness. Like, go find consciousness, but you don't need the whole cosmic consciousness. You just need a local piece of it. And so that's why, when people take these drugs or use certain breathing techniques, for example, that loosen that up biologically, they get these really wild cosmic experiences, and then they kind of come back to once the system reorients itself and says, whoa, slow down there, dude, you don't need all that.
Yes.
And brings it back, right? So, and that's, I've seen that people talk about that a little bit, but not that much. But I do think that's how it happened. But the genomes figured out how to access consciousness. Yeah. So in some organisms like us, presumably.
Yes. Yeah. So if say, for example, the Orcho R model in terms of how consciousness, because I'm trying to come up with like a metaphor here for anyone watching and for my own understanding. Are we saying here that, say, a bronze statue and a marble statue made of Zeus, could we say that the bronzeness is analogous to some kind of biological activity, or the marble is analogous to another type of biological activity or psychological activity, technically or theoretically, anything up and down a biopsychosocial stack, and a certain form of that beams in the Zeusness, like not so much like it's outside of space and time per se, but brings it in as something that's, as you're saying, greater than the sum of its parts per se.
Well, yeah, because a form is an abstract thing. It's very much like a Platonic ideal, or a Platonic form. I mean, that's where the whole business comes from. Now, Aristotle's bronze and marble thing is to show how the characteristics that an object have are partially dependent not only on what it's made of, that's the material cause, and not only how it got here, that's the efficient cause, but the form and shape in which the thing adopts as a whole. All right. So in this case, the Zeusness is referring to the characteristics that only show when you see the thing as a whole.
Yes, I'm with you.
Yeah. So now, one of the caveats to that, or corollaries to that, I think, is that artificial intelligence is very much possible. All we have to do is design a circuitry that adopts the particular form, and they will have consciousness in a similar sense than we do. So it's very possible in that sense. And that's one of the big questions in philosophy of mind is it possible? I don't see how it isn't possible unless you adopt some kind of, like those old theories that vitalism, that's it, vitalism. You'd have to believe in vitalism otherwise. And that doesn't have much to it, as far as I know. But does that answer your question, though?
Yeah, it does, and it leads on to a further point around the definition of consciousness. Because as I was saying earlier about, say, Sir Roger Penrose, his definition of consciousness is, say, proto-conscious, or when it's described in that way, it's obviously very different to a psychodynamic model, whether it's Freudian or Jungian or whatever. Consciousness behaves in a very, consciousness is different, it's dynamic. So, for example, one of the most interesting things with Jung, building on the work of Janet, Pierre Janet, is that the field of consciousness is dissociable into multiple different subnuclei. So whatever that's obviously a Janean word, the subnuclei, or with Jungian terms, we'd call it a complex, of course. How do we go with that in terms of, how do we carry the conversation on in that way? Because some of that kind of stuff appears less non-computable to me in terms of you can have a whole general field used metaphorically with multiple nodal points that can shift and sort of look at each other with a dynamic unconscious underneath. That appears more complicated to me. That doesn't exclude AI de facto at all, but it does say that it's going to be immensely complicated.
Oh,
in a circuit.
I mean, it's taken billions of years for life to figure it out. So, and of course, life does stuff that it's just like you were saying, how when they discovered the genome, I think it was tongue in cheek when they were saying 98% of it is junk. I mean, when I was working on my master's degrees, when they were saying that kind of stuff in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I was doing genetic research. And some people called it junk DNA, but I think most of us in the business were like, yeah, we just haven't figured out what it is.
Yeah.
Now we know it's not really junk, because that doesn't make any evolutionary sense. If it's not useful, eventually it would drift away. But anyway, that doesn't get at your question.
Well, to some degree, because obviously I was born in the 90s. That junk idea trickled its way down into school, and I learned in school that it was literally junk, and it's like there was no point. It's just somehow formed. And that's going to be the teachers not understanding things. So terms in the suggestibility can find their way all up and down, and
that's funny. That's helpful insight, because I think that you see that all the time. You've got stuff that the experts are working on, and then they report it to the popular media, and it gets completely garbled, or oversimplified to the point of unrecognizability. But to get at your question, though. There's two ways you can look at that, the dissociability of consciousness, right? So to say that a whole can be partitioned into parts is nothing special, right? Anything can be broken up into pieces. The question is, do the qualities that the whole have when they're not broken up somehow inhere in the parts, or is it only about a aspect of the form? Okay, so consciousness is dissociable, but that's not the same thing as saying that consciousness is derived from those dissociated parts. If I'm a pluralist, I'm going to say that it is. I'm going to say that all you need is your pieces, parts of consciousness You jam them together and poof, consciousness appears, right? Except that we can't explain how, but never mind that. And that's the reason why I think pluralism is not the way to go. But the alternative is kind of weird. It kind of, you have to get your head around it a little bit, because the pluralist says, and this is actually a very ancient philosophical point of view. The pluralist says consciousness, even though chronologically it's at the end of the process, ontologically it is prior. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So the consciousness as a whole is the most primary. So it's as the pieces parts coalesce and they acquire more and more properties closer and closer to full consciousness, they are actually becoming more fundamental, not less. Because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the whole is prior to the parts, ontologically speaking. So that, in order to explain that, I have to invoke formal causation and say that, because the question is going to be, okay, where does the consciousness come from? And I'm going to say it comes from the form that the pieces adopt. And I think the thing that confuses people is because you look at a child, say, who goes from a single cell to a walking and talking and breathing person with consciousness, you're going to, naturally, we tend to ask ourselves, well, at what point does the consciousness magically worm its way in there?
Yeah.
When really what's going on is they're becoming more and more and more fundamental. They're becoming more and more whole and integrated, which is the end goal of a lot of this stuff, to be integrated. But breaking it up pulls you back in the process. So the dissociation, even though we do it as a defense, it can, of course, petrify, and it becomes a big problem. And that's when we got all these complexes and all that. And the goal of therapy is to get you back on track to more an integrated state. And you can even see this in brains where in consciousness is disrupted, you've got parts operating independently of each other. And the more conscious awareness and even like deep consciousness of like meditative states, you have even higher levels of integration and cooperation across the hemispheres. So
I'm with you.
All right, cool.
Yeah, I think to fully expand on a lot of this, because a lot of this in my head as well is a complete work in progress. You know,
Yeah,
it's super useful to get your help on that, but that would probably require a lot more time than we have today to go into consciousness, because I'd like to bring in some of the more quantum physics models of that and say compare it to a more, say, electrical model to see what the differences are, and then to bring in Hameroff and Penrose and their non-computational aspect of consciousness, and how perhaps complexes are split off quantum fields and all that kind of cool stuff that we've been talking about recently.
Well, at least we've got plenty of material to work on and make for future videos.
I've really enjoyed our conversation today. That the time has just flown by. It's been fantastic.
It has. I don't get a chance to talk about this stuff very often.
No. Well, thanks so much for talking with me today, and we'll do this again really soon.
All righty. Glad to be here.
If you enjoyed this video and want to continue your study of psychosystems analysis, then check the description for links to further resources, including our Discord server, our suite of educational handbooks, and our application page for professional training under Steve and Pauline Richards, leading to accreditation as a hypnotherapist and psychotherapist. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next video.